thewellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
You're listening to A Quirky Journey, the healthy family podcast with your hosts Jo Whitten and Fuad Kassab.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to A Quirky Journey. This is your host, Jo Whitten, and with me is the most amazing man on the planet, Fuad Kassab.
You know I'm recording. This is just the start of the podcast now.
Oh my God, we've started it?
I think that's a good start.
Thank you so much, Jo.
You can start again if you want.
No, that's all right. But I'm glad I wasn't talking about, anything embarrassing.
I wouldn't have started again, wouldn't I?
Yeah, you would have had to. How's it going? You're feeling good?
I'm feeling good. Yes.
So that's that. And where were we? Yes, we have a podcast right now after this chat.
Yes, we do. Amazingly.
With Dr. Ron Ehrlich.
Yes.
Awesome guy. We met him at the Mind Foundation. He's a holistic dentist. Mind Forum. Sorry. A holistic dentist. And he's written a book called A Life Less Stressed. Right?
Yep.
That's the name of the book.
That's the book.
And he gave me a copy when I was there. Did he give you a copy too?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was such a good book. It was really good.
Very practical.
Quite often people will focus on just one aspect of health, like nutrition, say, or movement, or whatever it is. He talks about all sorts of stuff, including dental stress, and he gets into these topics in a way that is understandable. And I find it's really suitable, this book, for a beginner who's like, if you want someone to start understanding about health, you can give them this book, but it will also give you a lot of information. Even if you already are well on your way on the health journey, you'll understand quite a bit more. And it's a really great interview with Dr. Ron.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Loved it. He practices out of Sydney. The details for his practice are in the show notes as well. Mm-hmm. And you can go, if you want to see him, you can go see him there. He's a really cool guy. He knows what he's doing, knows what he's talking about. And he's not only like holistic, as a dentist, he's got holistic health covered and all these things. And it really, really shows in the book as well. And if you meet him in person, you'll know. Really, really cool dude.
Yeah. We had a podcast that Isaac and I did with him on his channel as well. So he has a podcast channel, and he interviewed us before the Mind Forum. Yeah. So I haven't listened to a lot of his podcasts, but go and have a look, because he does have some really, because he's a holistic dentist, like Fuad was saying, it's so much more than dental. Like, he goes into sleep patterns, and he talks about the way you breathe and the stress on your body and all sorts of things. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. On to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you made it this far, because it is a really useful show, and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Ron. It's so good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks, Fuad.
How's it going, Ron?
It's going extremely well. It's life is good. I'm lots of exciting things happening, and enjoying my time in my surgery. I'm in there a couple of days a week, and then doing my own podcast, and of course all the stuff around the book. So and the family, surrounded by family. So it doesn't get much better than that. I'm a lucky man.
You sound a bit like us. We've just got so many different things to focus on each day, but it's such a great life, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I've just now coming up for my 63rd birthday, and I feel like I'm just hitting my stride now, getting a good rhythm. So, I'm looking forward to the next couple of years. And
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it was good to meet you at the Mind Forum. We were all there. How many weeks ago was it? Only 2 or 3?
Yeah, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, but it is always such a fantastic event, the 3-day Mind Forum. I think this was the 10th, or maybe there was more. But
oh, wow. I've only been to one other.
I just love the way that there's a public stream and a
me too.
Practitioner stream running side by side. And it's just great to meet so many practitioners, and to get to meet so many people in the public as well. So it's always a great event. Always has been.
Yeah, well, I think as a person in the public section, I just love being able to meet the practitioners, because it's pretty rare to get to talk to so many people like you. And we've just learned so much through listening to, podcasts and going to the Mind Forum. And so we hope to share a bit of that on the podcast today. We were trying to discuss what we'd talk about today, and we have a couple of things that we'd really love to get into. So first of all, you're a holistic dentist, but you've also become an author, and you've written a book called A Life Less Stressed. Do you want to explain how you got into what you do and sort of where it all began for you? Just give us a bit of your story.
Yeah, well, look, I've been in practice now for almost 40 years, and a very short time after I graduated, I treated a patient who had a high crown, a tooth that was too high and it was uncomfortable, and I adjusted it, and they came back a week later and they said, ever since then, the crown feels more comfortable, but I haven't had any of the headaches that I've had for the last 5 years. And I thought, gee, that's quite a coincidence. And then when I explored more, I realized that the way the teeth fit together has a dramatic impact on people's headaches, neck aches, jaw pain and all that. So that I embarked on a learning experience of treating chronic pain. And chronic headaches and neck aches are pretty common. So that was the beginning, very early on in my career, of recognizing that what I did had the potential to affect other things in the body besides just the teeth and the gums. And in about 1983, I was attending lots and lots of courses over in America, in Europe, and in Australia. And in 1983, I'd attended a course which posed a model of stress that said our health is affected by stress, and stress is a combination of emotional, environmental, postural, nutritional, and dental stress. And so this was a really eye-opening, an aha moment for me, because it kind of made a more holistic context of where I fitted into, where what I did and what I was seeing fitted into an overall health picture. And since then, it's been the model that I've used in my practice as a SAFE since 1983, and that's when we started the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre, which I work with my brother. So my brother and I have been working together for 40 years.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it still seems it's going well. I mean, it may be a bit early to call. So far, so good. And so that's where the journey really started for us, realizing that, well, I felt I needed to know a lot more about nutrition, a lot more about posture. At that point, at that stage in my life, I didn't feel very comfortable talking to people about emotional stress, and I was in my 20s at the time, so it didn't seem appropriate. But environmental stress was a whole new area. I mean, that was not big in 1983, but to have it out there as an issue to look at. So it just started a whole journey of learning for me. I got my fellowship in nutritional and environmental medicine from the Australasian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. I got that in 1996, and it's been an interest ever since. Look, I still do dentistry is what I do clinically, but I feel very comfortable talking about all those other areas. It's just that's not what I practice on a daily basis. And that just led me eventually to writing a book, because through this journey of treating chronic pain, it also led me into exploring sleep. And as soon as, about quality, getting a consistently good night's sleep. And as soon as you do that, you get involved in breathing. And as soon as that, you get involved in posture. And so it leads on. So the book I wrote, which, as you say, is A Life Less Stress, The 5 Pillars of Health and Wellness. And I have to tell people it's not autobiographical. I wish it was. It's aspirational for me. And it was. It took me about 2 or 3 years to write that book, but it was a great way of just collating everything that I'd been interested up to this point in my life, and just to kind of act as a springboard for the next phase of my life.
It's a really good book. Great book actually for the public. It's not a science-heavy book. It's very conversational. The topics are easy to understand, and you really like to draw a really wide picture. So you talk about everything from big pharma to the food pyramid, and how these things are actually affecting and have affected our health. It's such a great thing to see that's all written in one book. And you mentioned earlier the pillars of stress, or the 5 pillars. Maybe you can walk us through them one by one, give us a high level view of them, maybe starting with the emotional stress, which you weren't very comfortable talking about in your 20s, but hopefully at the age of 63.
Well, I mean, it's what people, whenever you say you've written a book about stress, or does stress affect our lives, emotional stress is the thing that immediately springs to everybody's mind. And
number one.
Actually, almost everybody that I've said, I've written a book about stress, it's called The Life Less Stressed, I must read that book. And I actually hope they do, because people can relate to it. I mean, the emotional stress, excuse me, is a big one, because, thoughts are things. Thoughts are things. They are neurotransmitters. They are little proteins that eventually attach themselves to our cell membranes, and they cause our genes to express themselves in some way or another. And that's that puts it into a sort of a biochemical perspective. And when you think about stress, it's relative. I think people that have gone through wars, people that have gone through the First World War, Second World War, any war for that matter, who've gone through famine, who have gone through depression, who have gone, whatever. There have been some incredible stresses in our world in the last, thousands of years, but let's say the last 100 years. And so when we look at our lives today, we kind of think they're so stressful. But when we relate it back to historical times, it may surprise people to learn that we're actually living in one of the best times in human history.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that when you look at the news every night. Excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold my darling little granddaughter gave me. Who's just gone back into childcare. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So it's hard for people to imagine that we're actually living in the best time in human history. Because there was a study done in about 2012 which said 56 million people died in 2012, and 130,000 of those died from violent crimes, wars, or gunshots. It turns out that 800,000 died of suicide, and 1.5 million died of of diabetes.
Wow.
So one could argue that rather than being concerned about terrorists and the awfully violent world in which we supposedly live, you are actually a greater danger to yourself than a terrorist, and sugar is the biggest danger of them all.
That's a really good point. I'm going to tell my kids that one.
Yeah, so I think it's very easy for us to feel emotionally stressed because of what we're bombarded with. And then what's unique about our current world is we are bombarded by information constantly. And if you follow your emails, if you follow Twitter, if you follow Facebook, if you follow Instagram, if you follow Snapchat, if you follow the news and you have your push notifications switched onto your phone, you could be excused for having your head down the whole day. And in fact, when you get onto a train and you look down the carriage, up the carriage, hundreds of people are all with their heads down. And so we are terrific at being connected with the rest of the world, but we're not fabulous about being connected with the person sitting next to us. And there was a Harvard study done recently, well, actually been going on for 75 years, but they released what the greatest predictor of longevity and wellness was, and it turns out that our relationships are the most important indicator of a person's well-being. So, and that's relationships of real people sitting right next to you. So it doesn't have to be a loved one, although if you're lucky enough to be in a lovely relationship, that's great, but it can be family, it can be friends, it can be a community, it can be whatever it is, but it's relating to people. So, it's really easy today to get lost in this emotional stress, and because of what we're bombarded with on a social media level, it's very easy to get stressed out. And we did an interview. I did an interview recently on anxiety in youth, and found that 25% of kids have been diagnosed, that's under the age of 18, have been diagnosed with anxiety. And this is a really disturbing. The incidence of depression in childhood has gone up it's doubled in the last 20 years. So when you look at what kids are exposed to today, particularly on social media, and the expectations of themselves and each other, it's really easy to see how these kind emotionally stressed individuals, be they young and old, emerge. So that's emotional stress in a little bit of a taste of what I talk about in that chapter.
All these things do tie into each other because, as you said before, these thoughts are actually physiological as well. They have a physiological impact, and when we look at improving one thing, we also start seeing improvements in the other side as well. And like for me, for instance, I improved the way that I was eating, and my emotional stress improved as well at the same time. Maybe also we'll keep going with these pillars.
That's a really good point, Fuad, because, of course, although the chapters in a book are linear, 1 follows 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, they're actually interconnected and they're inseparable. So, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know that the gut is now referred to as the second brain. And the gut is where a lot of those neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin, are produced. So, what you eat and how you think is hugely impacted. What you think and how you sleep is hugely impacted. How you breathe while you are asleep and the effect that has on your emotional resilience is also impacted. So, they're all interconnected. So then the next chapter is really about, another one of the chapters on stress is environmental stress. And that is a huge, huge topic, sadly. And, the thing about chemicals, and we're exposed to tens of thousands of chemicals on a daily basis. I mean, when you look at what happens when you wake up in the morning. Now, you wake up in the morning and you're lying in bed and there may be fire retardant on your pajamas or on your bedding, certainly within your bed. So there are brominated products there. Then you walk into the bathroom and you might put on, if you're a man, you might, what I noticed, you do have a shave. So, we put on shaving cream, and how many chemicals are in that? And then we get under the shower and then we have put on shampoo and there's another 20 chemicals there and conditioner.
And the water itself in the shower.
The water itself, the chlorinated water, opening up the pores, ensuring that any chemicals within the water are well absorbed into your body, and then you get out and you put underarm deodorant. You haven't even walked downstairs for breakfast yet, and you've already been exposed to 50, 60, 100, 200, how many chemicals we don't know. And you might be excused for assuming that if it's on the shelf in the supermarket, it's been tested and it will be fine. It just wouldn't be there if it wasn't tested. Well, sadly, that's not the case. Out of the 140,000 chemicals that are out there at the moment, probably about 10%, if we're lucky, have been tested in any meaningful way. And by meaningful, they're tested singularly. So you might test a toxin and say, I've tested it over a 6 or 8 week period and they're it's okay. But of course, we don't use toxins over 6 or 8 weeks. We use them over years, number one. Number two, we don't use one chemical in isolation for another. So how do you set up an experiment that takes into account all of those different chemicals? The synergistic effect of chemicals is significant. And the significance of that is if you give a chemical a toxic value of 1 and another chemical a toxic value of 1, when you add the two together, 1 plus 1 may not necessarily equal 2. 1 plus 1 may equal 5 or 10. It could have a multiplied effect. So, this highlights the need, and then we talk about soils and we talk about the way the pesticides, the herbicides, the fungicides. I mean, the effect that has on not only the food but the soil microbiome is a huge thing. So we have to start thinking about how do we minimize our exposure, and it can be very depressing when you hear about this. But the good news is that if you are aware of it and you make good choices, you can reduce your own toxic load by 80 or 90%. So that's quite empowering, I think. So, but in order to solve a problem, you've got to know what the problem is. And I think that's the first step. And so outlining how one could think about these environmental stresses is kind of important, and empowering people to take control of it themselves is another one. And then, there's the whole agitating for change and the ground force, which I think, your podcast, my podcast, a lot of things that are happening on the ground, literally on the ground, is going to have an effect globally, we hope.
Yeah. This is why I really loved your book, because you're not only making it centered around the human being who's reading the book, but you've got, for instance, within the chapter for environmental stress, you have unhealthy soil equals unhealthy plants equals unhealthy animals equals unhealthy humans equals unhealthy planet, and you really link it up to our place in the natural world. And if we're trying to be healthy, the other parts of the picture also need to be looked after as well. So then a human being who's looking after themselves, their actions need to start reflecting outwards into the world, so that the world can start changing as well, which is wonderful. And I'm going on a bit of a rant here, because what I really
go.
I've had some. I haven't read through the whole book, but from what I've read, I've seen that you talked about Alan Savory's work, for instance, which you talk about.
He's a hero of mine.
Yeah, and mine too, and the book Sapiens as well, which is a really great book, and all these things that I've read about over the years, and I've found them collated in this one book, which is really, really fantastic, and it's all sort of centered around this idea of creating a healthy human being, but finding that the human being is also part of a larger picture, and how they can relate to the larger picture and create health for themselves and the planet. So what's been your experience over the years in terms of seeing things change, and where do you feel we're at the moment in this advocacy, just from my for my selfish perspective, to see what you've seen over the years?
Yeah. Well, I feel that I'm optimistic about what's possible, and I'm a little bit pessimistic about what's happening. And, I'm having an each way bet there. I mean, look, Alan Savory was somebody who now, I've been very interested in holistic healthcare for all of this time. And what I found so enlightening about Alan Savory's work is that he's involved in holistic management, holistic land management, but holistic management. And so this opened up a whole new idea. And he once said to me when I interviewed him, actually just recently, he said, look, if you're expecting the change to come from above, and by that I'm not talking about God, that's a whole other subject. If you're expecting the change to come from above, from governments, from professional organisations, you may be waiting a long time, because big organisations are very slow to take on new information. They lack common sense, and they lack humanity.
Yes.
And I think that's true. The change in Alan, this is almost quoting verbatim, the change has to come from the ground up, and that's from you and me. And so that's what I believe is happening. I believe, it's an interesting thing, this influence of technology, because I mentioned it as a emotional stress, and it is. I feel like we're new kids on the block. We're new kids playing with a toy that we haven't quite understood completely. We've understood. We want to play with it all the time. We love it. And you look at people; they're obsessed with it. I'm guilty of it myself sometimes. But I think I'm optimistic there, because I think there is the democratization of information. Number one, a lot of people have got a lot of access to a lot of information, and I think that is a good thing. And the second thing is we have this ability to communicate with each other and organize ourselves. Now, that, when you look at what's happened in politics in the last 2 years, has had I think a negative effect. In fact, it's if anything polarized us more. But I think this is going to be a question of regulation, and I think we're going to learn to come to terms with that. I think we've had we've overshot the mark a bit with technology, which has manifested itself in mental health problems, in political problems. But I believe that we are going to come back to a point where we understand its limitations, we understand its potential, and we use it in a very constructive and powerful way. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I don't think we've got a choice anymore. I read an article last year, I can't remember where, but they were saying that there's 100 harvests left in the UK before the unsustainable farming methods that they're having, they are going to ruin the topsoil and it can't be grown in anymore. So we're getting to that point with so many things like that where we've reached beyond sustainability.
Yes. Well, there was a very interesting. I just did an interview recently with, get this, Professor Paul Ehrlich, and he's a really very famous ecologist who wrote a book in the 60s and then again another one in the 80s on population explosion and the effect that the increase in population would have on our environment, catastrophic. And he said you wouldn't be able to feed these number of people. But of course, along came the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution introduced pesticides, introduced fungicides, fertilizers, industrialized farming, industrialized animal production, factory farming of animals. And the world has been fed. It is true. But at what cost? Yes, there is an increase in population. Yes, we have an increase in life expectancy. But how are we doing as individuals, and how are we doing as a planet? And when you reflect back on the last 30 or 40 years, which is the Green Revolution, and dovetail that in with the politics of economic rationalism and deregulating the market, and consumerism is great and it's what drives economies, the combination of those things hasn't really addressed the issues about population and feeding people and making the people and the planet healthy.
Dental stress now. I want to sort of take it back to something within our mouths.
Yeah, what can something that we can do step at.
Well, I wrote that chapter for anybody. I wrote that chapter on dental stress for anybody with a mouth who is interested in their health but has never fully connected the two. Because most people think that if they're not in pain, oral health is not an issue, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, in our practice, we sit around in our office. There are 5 of us dentists, and we talk about this just recently because we just did a podcast on it recently, and we said that 95% at least of oral health disease has no pain associated with it. So, people often ask, what is I know it's pretty staggering, isn't it? But that is the fact. But then people say, what's a holistic dentist? And a holistic dentist is somebody who recognizes there's a whole person attached to the mouth they're always looking at. And that may sound obvious, but it has implications. The implication is that you recognize that the mouth is the gateway to the digestive tract. So, the idea of what your teeth are there for is to chew, break down, and start the process of digestion. And doing that effectively sets the digestive process up for success. So digestion's number one. So if teeth are crooked and crowded or missing or broken down, it's like taking a blunt knife to cut up a piece of meat. It's not so easy to do, so you end up swallowing it in its unbroken down form, and that's not a very good thing. So it's the gateway to the digestive tract. It's the gateway to the respiratory tract. So the shape and size of your upper and lower jaws and your oral cavity determine the shape and size of the upper airway. And if you have crowded teeth, so we have evolved to have all 32 of our 32 teeth. That's what we as humans over millions of years have evolved to have. But if I ask 95%, if I look out there, and I've asked this question of many, many people over the last few years, I would estimate that probably again about 95% of people have some form of crowding. That means that very few people have, maybe 5% have enough room for all 32 of their teeth. The significance of that is that if you've got a narrow upper airway, it predisposes you to breathing issues, not the least of which is mouth breathing, which can affect your posture and your body chemistry. Mouths are for feeding, noses are for breathing. So you should be breathing through your nose. It's a very important part of keeping your body chemistry balanced. It's an important part of keeping your posture well. You know, if you're a mouth breather, your head will come forward. And if you think sleeping's important, which of course it is, sleeping is a function of quantity, getting enough sleep, and quality, breathing well while you're asleep. So if you have a narrow upper airway, you have the potential for breathing problems at night. And they are very common, not just in overweight, middle-aged men and beyond, but in young children and in people of all ages. So there is the digestive tract, there is the respiratory tract. It is also the site of the two most common infections known to man, woman or child, and that is tooth decay and gum disease. And 90% of the adult population, that is over 20, 90% have had some degree of decay in their permanent teeth. You know, the incidence of gum disease is equally very high. Do your gums ever bleed when you brush or floss? Well, if they do, that's a sign of inflammation. So that's not a good thing either. Because of tooth decay, we also implant more materials, more foreign materials into people's bodies than all other health professionals put together. Mm. We do fillings, we do crowns, we do implants, we do dentures, you know, so you'd want to hope that the filling materials are compatible with good health and are not toxic. It's an environmental issue, but it's a health issue as well. And then there's the whole thing that led me into this, which is because of the sensitivity of this area, the mouth, and because when you clench your jaw, muscles tighten up at the back of your neck and down your back and into your lower back and even down into your calf muscle when you clench your jaw, then the connection between jaw function, jaw balance, clenching and grinding, and chronic pain is an interesting one as well. So that's kind of some of the things that I cover in the dental stress. Aren't you glad you asked?
Wow.
I am.
There's so many things there I'd like to ask questions about, but maybe going back to your influences in learning all this, can you tell us how the work of Weston A. Price has influenced you? I think you were influenced by him.
Oh yes, well, you know, now Weston A. Price, I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of him, but for those that haven't, Weston A. Price was a dentist in the early part of the 20th century in America, and when decay was rampant, he wanted to find out what caused decay. So what he did was he embarked on a global tour over many, many years where he visited various parts of the world. He visited the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. He visited the Eskimos the Inuits in Alaska. He visited North American Native Americans, Native South Americans. He visited Polynesian. He visited New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, and Africa. And what he did was he went in and looked at people who were living in a traditional culture, in a traditional village, and looked at traditional foods. And what he found was that these people had not only no tooth decay, but they also had enough room for all 32 of their teeth with some space behind their wisdom teeth.
No one had to get wisdom teeth pulled.
They did not have to have wisdom teeth pulled. And also they had enough, they didn't have any of the degenerative diseases that was happening in the modern world: cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis. They didn't have any of that. But what made it even more interesting was that he could go down the road into more urbanized areas of villages and towns and cities where the same genetic group had moved into these urban environments and were starting to eat Western food. And what he found was that within a very short period of time, literally within a year, the evidence of decay would surface and that these degenerative diseases were becoming prevalent and were pronounced. And what he also found was that within one generation, the next generation had narrow jaws and crowded teeth. So this was a hugely important bit of research. And what was interesting was, you know, we hear about vegetarianism, we hear about veganism, we hear about paleo, we hear about ketogenic. all of the people in all of the different parts of the world were eating a whole variety of foods. Whole variety of foods. Some were eating grains, some were eating vegetables, some were eating dairy, some were eating meat, some were only eating meat and blubber, some were not eating any meat. So there was, but what did they all have in common? So what he took back to America was food samples. And remember, this was now in the 1920s. And what he found was that they all had a few things in common. Firstly, they were all nutrient-dense foods. They all had at least 10 times the amount of vitamins, water-soluble vitamins and minerals than the average American diet. In the 1920s this was, don't forget.
Wow, imagine now.
Imagine now. And also, this was the really interesting part, that they had 4 times the amount of fat-soluble vitamins. Wow. So that is A, D, E, and K. Although he didn't call it K at the time, he called it Activator X. He couldn't identify what K was, but he knew it was essential for bone and tooth development. And so you need fat-soluble vitamins in order to absorb minerals. And so, this was the critical point. And when you look at sugar consumption and flour consumption in the 1930s, and you look at sugar consumption and flour consumption in the 2018s, I think Preston A. Price will be turning over in his grave. Now, tooth decay it's still a major problem. It's still a major, major problem, but it has gone down. And the reason I believe that it has gone down, because it's gone down in fluoridated and non-fluoridated countries, is because people are more conscious of brushing their teeth.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so you get the problem out of your mouth, but that still causes problems further down the body, and that's why we have an epidemic in degenerative diseases.
And how does it affect the jaw to make it narrow? Was that the food, or is that more the breathing, or?
Okay, well, that's a really good question, because I think there are 3 or 4 answers to that. One is the health of the mother and father from even before conception, the diet, the nutrient-dense diet, ideally that they should be on, or throughout pregnancy, or throughout infancy, or childhood, or adulthood. So nutrient-dense diet is number 1. The chewability of foods is another one. To be using your jaw functionally, to use the muscles of the jaw is important. The other thing is that if you have a narrow jaw and you don't have enough, and you also then have allergies or have difficulty breathing through your nose, then you're going to become a mouth breather. Now, the problem with that is the best orthodontic appliance ever is the human tongue. And the human tongue should be resting on the palate. People should have their mouth closed when they're breathing. Their lips should be lightly touching. Their tongue should be on the roof of their mouth. Their teeth should either be slightly apart or lightly touching, but certainly not clenching. And they should be slowly breathing through their nose. We swallow 1,200 times a day. So every time we swallow, the tongue presses against the palate. And this broad, flat muscle, the tongue, develops a broad, flat upper jaw. And that's ideally gives us the shape. And then that creates room for your lower jaw to sit in underneath your upper jaw. And so it's this balance of tongue and lips and cheeks. Now, if you have a mouth breather, the tongue drops from the roof of the mouth. And so now you've got the force of the lips and the cheeks acting on the jaws, and that's bringing them in and making them narrow. So we have a combination of food quality, the type of food, and also the balance of muscles in the mouth. It's called oral myology. It's and the way we breathe that impacts on how this develops.
It's interesting because I've always had trouble with a narrow jaw and crowded teeth. And when I was a small child, I always had trouble with food intolerances. And I was always having a runny nose and stuffy nose. And I guess I was breathing through my mouth all the time. And then that went back, like the food intolerances were all related to gut health. So there you go. There's that, the gut.
Yeah. Yeah,
and then
they're
the
all connected.
balances, and then the breathing, and then the teeth. And, you know, my mum, Fuad laughs at this, my mum always used to tell us, well, the reason why you've got really crowded teeth, and a lot of us do in our family, is because we've got the German family, so that's like
Yes.
a bigger jaw, and then we've got, we've got the German family, which is, I can't remember what she said, but it was something to do with the American Indian and the German mixture. She said, that's why. I'm like, no, Mum, that's not why.
That's not why. It's like how your mother had green eyes and your father had brown eyes. Yeah. Do you have one brown eye and one green eye? You don't. I mean, David Bowie may have, but...
well, my nephew actually does. But
there you go. But it's unusual.
It is.
Yeah. So there's an awful lot going on there in terms of dental stress, and it is definitely impacted on by nutritional things. Yeah. It's impacted by postural things. So, there's an awful lot going on there.
I've got the postural too. I've got scoliosis. There you go. Well, can you...
We're ruined, Joe. We're ruined.
I know, but you know what? Actually, I've got to tell you this. You know how in Weston A. Price's work he talks about how you can widen the jaw by changing your diet, and, you know, also like you're saying, my son did a course at a holistic dentist with learning to position his tongue properly so that it would help his teeth. Yep. So there is things that you can work on, and it's funny, we did the GAPS diet to work on our gut health, and in a year, the difference in the photographs of my face it looked longer and narrower, you know, a year before, and I wonder if my jaw did widen. It looks like it in the photos.
Can it, Ron, would like an adult's face actually rearrange itself if proper nutrition is given?
Well, I think that may be pushing it a little bit.
Okay. Because that's what I heard, and I was thinking, I wonder if it did.
No, but let me just say that my oldest patient doing orthodontics, where we are expanding jaws, and is 82 years old. So you know, it can definitely be done. Whether it can just be done, I mean, I think it can be done, to be honest. I think it can be done with myofunctional exercises, meaning proper exercises for your tongue and lips. And the benefit of that is it's often described as having a facelift, because it really
that's what the dentist told me.
Yeah, it really tones the muscles of your face up. But you need to be really motivated. And if you are, it can be done. You need to be doing those exercises 6 times a day, you know, and it can be done, though.
You should write down what that is in case anyone wants to know about it. What's that called again?
It's called oral myology, and I can certainly give you...
Myology, M-Y?
M-Y-O-L-O-G-Y, oral myology.
And that would be something that they would talk to their holistic dentist
Well, there's probably, holistic dentists. You see, when they did a study on all the different orthodontic techniques that were undertaken over a 40-year period. And that means, you know, teeth were extracted, teeth weren't extracted, jaws were expanded, jaws weren't expanded, Whichever technique you chose, what they found was that there was some relapse to some degree in almost 90% of cases. And the reason for that is that oral myology, the actual cause of the problem, is never addressed or rarely addressed. It is becoming so in a holistic dental practice, and you know, so that's an emerging science. Some orthodontists will just poo-poo the whole thing and say, it's rubbish. But what they really mean is they don't know anything about it.
Ron, with the term holistic dentist, I'm just wondering, is there like a particular training that a dentist will undergo to call themselves a holistic dentist, or is it someone who's actually thrown themselves into a holistic approach to health and then have become aware of what they need to do? Like, is there a qualification, or what do you look for when someone says they're holistic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there is no accreditation. Let me just say that. But obviously, I think it's a dentist with an attitude, or a practitioner with an attitude, and you would hope that attitude is more than just a marketing attitude. You see, it has become a little bit popularized. I mean, when we first changed the name of our practice in 1983 to the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre, you know, people thought, what's holistic? And people still ask that question now, although the word holistic is becoming a lot more understood. I mean, it's not some kind of new age philosophy. It's just the way the world works. It's the way the human body works. But in terms of accreditation, sadly, there's not. I mean, I think this is a case of, you have to get a feel for what the people are about. And I think that's true of any practitioner you go and see, whether they call themselves a holistic dentist or not. I know a lot of practitioners, my colleagues, who are very holistic in their approach to dental treatment, but they don't call themselves holistic.
Yeah.
So it works both ways. I think the profession is moving into a more holistic phase. They're recognizing their role in sleep. They're recognizing the connection between gum disease and a lot of diseases. So they are really being more holistic. I think our profession is changing quite dramatically.
I'd like to understand that a little bit more. Like, what can be achieved with holistic dentistry as opposed to conventional dentistry?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, people come in to see us. We're in a really privileged position as dentists because if you're diligent, you'll be coming into the dentist every 6 to 12 months for a checkup. And remember, don't wait for pain because 95% of problems have no pain associated with them. So when people come into us, yes, we're checking, of course, their gum health and tooth decay, but it's a great opportunity for us to check in with them about their sleep. And I ask them 3 very basic questions. This is routine, by the way. Routine. I ask 3 questions, and I'd ask these of your listeners. Firstly, is it easy for you to go to sleep at night? And the answer, obviously, is either yes or no. The second question is, do you wake up through the night? And a lot of people wake up to go to the bathroom. A lot of people wake up and have trouble going back to sleep. This is a problem, and we can come back to the solutions to that in a moment. And the third question, which is probably the most important question, is do you wake up feeling refreshed? Because after all, why do we sleep? And we sleep because this is our body's chance to regenerate, to reboot. I've had a neurologist explain it to me that it's a chance for the synapses in our nerves to regenerate and to freshen up, if you like, so that our nervous system is working better. It certainly affects our brain. It certainly affects our hormones. So waking up feeling refreshed is really important. In fact, not waking up feeling refreshed over a long period of time can be life-threatening. So there is an initial point of where I think a holistic dental practice, it's obvious that you're in a holistic dental practice. So whether they call themselves that or not, there it is. The other thing that I should have mentioned straight away is that one of the very first things we do when we clinically examine a patient, and I'm sure every dentist does this, I'm sure your dentists, Fuad and Joe, have done this as well, and that is we look at a patient's lips, their tongue, their cheeks, the palate, the floor of the mouth, the back of the throat, the glands under the jaw. Why? Because oral cancer is now the 10th most common cancer in Australia.
Really?
So, and it's an opportunity on a 6 or 12 monthly basis to do an oral cancer screening. And I'm sure every dentist does this. And we tell our patients that. We say, when I do this for the first time on people, they're wondering, what the hell is he doing? He's pulling my lip out and he's looking at my cheek and my tongue, and stick your tongue out and push your tongue to the left and the right and lift it up and say R and look down the back of the throat. Oral cancer is a serious, serious problem. And in the last, say, 10 years of my clinical life, I've had thankfully only three patients who have had oral cancer, but it is the most potentially horrendous thing. One was a 53-year-old woman who had a small ulcer on her tongue. She ended up needing her tongue resected. Now, if you ever bitten your tongue or burnt your tongue and you think, oh, God, it's so uncomfortable, try losing your tongue.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened to a 23-year-old girl.
Oh, dear.
Woman. And another one was a 29-year-old guy who came in to me as a new patient because he had a loose tooth. He thought he had a loose tooth at the back of his mouth. And when I felt his teeth, all of his teeth on the upper right moved. And he had an advanced form of bone cancer. Wow. So these are horrendous things. And so we make a point that oral cancer screening is a critical part of any dental practice, but certainly any holistic dental practice. So sleep is another one. Chronic pain. Do you wake up in the morning with a headache, neck or jaw pain? Do you suffer from reflux or indigestion, heartburn?
Are you regular with your bowel movements? All of these things are relevant in a dental practice.
Wow.
Can you reverse cavities with holistic dentistry, or is it still like drill and fill kind of thing?
Yeah, now there's a very interesting book. I'm sure you're referring to the one about healed tooth decay and all of this. And a lot of people come in and read it. What I will say is this. When you change your diet, you can arrest decay. You can stop the decay process.
Right.
And provided the tooth doesn't have a defect in it, meaning a hole, where food continually catches in, then that's okay. But when you've got decay within a tooth that has resulted in a hole, a defect, tooth will not grow back.
Right.
Tooth will not grow back. Now, I've had a patient come in to me and say they want the decay removed, but they don't want a filling. And I go, look, I've only been in practice for 40 years, and I've certainly got an open mind, and I've read all the books. I've read that book about healed tooth decay and all of that. And the thing that annoyed me about that book, and he was referencing Weston A. Price's work, and Weston A. Price's work on fat-soluble vitamins, which we've already talked about. The thing that bothered me about that book was that there were no before and after photos.
Oh, really?
Now, you see, I'm holding a pen in my hand, and in my surgery, I have a camera that is no bigger than a pen, and it takes me literally 2 seconds, 5, maybe 10 seconds, to take a photo of a patient's mouth. It's so easy. It's so easy. So can you imagine how long it would have taken me, with all that I've been trying to instill in my patients, if we had regrown a tooth or regrown tooth structure, how easy it would have been for me to take a photo of it and put it on the internet and show the before and after, because we always take before photos, we always take during and after photos as well. So in answer to your question, Fawad, yes, you can arrest decay by changing your diet, for sure. I believe you can. And you can, but if there is a defect within the tooth hole, a cavity, then it needs to be restored. Otherwise, it's going to continue to catch food in it. And, then even nutritious food can ferment, and that's not such a good thing. And B, it's not functional, working as a chewing device that it's meant to be.
Yeah.
And what do you generally fill with so that it's not toxic?
Yes. Well, the last time I used Mercury Amalgam in my practice was 1985. So we haven't used that, and we're extremely careful how we remove it. But to replace it, I use, if the filling isn't very big, or it's generally a composite resin. And if the filling is larger, then I would use a ceramic or zirconium. And we've tried over the last 10 or 15 years to stay away as much as we can from metals. There is a thing called metal-induced chronic inflammation, which I think people will read more and more about. I reference it in my book. We try to stay away from metals, and because for a whole range of reasons, not just the cell-mediated immune response, the type 4 allergic response. People think allergies are just about you eat something and suddenly you start sneezing or you break out in hives. That's a type 1 reaction called an IgE reaction. A type 4 reaction is a cell-mediated reaction of which, metals can be part of that. So we try to stay away from metals as much as we can, and we use basically resins, and we use ceramics.
Okay.
How would you go about getting rid of the amalgam fillings?
Look, you need to approach that very cautiously, I believe. Look, the average life of a filling, according to the literature, amalgam filling, and composite for that matter, is between 10 and 12 years. Now,
is that all?
Yes, that's all. Because you get what's called micro leakage, which means the join between the filling and the tooth starts to break down a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
And bacteria can see that breakdown a hell of a lot earlier than we can. And so they leak down into that, and they start to cause decay in that part of the tooth. So you get micro leakage and decay. So you need to do a very careful assessment of the depth of the filling, of the degree of micro leakage, Are there cracks within a filling? So you've got to do a very careful assessment. Now, if you then determine that the mercury filling should come out, whether it's one or many, it should always be done with a rubber dam. That's a sheet of rubber where a hole is punched through so the teeth can protrude through, but it protects the lips and the tongue and the cheeks, and it protects the airway. So that when you drill out a filling, you do it very carefully, that you try and take it out in lumps and not grind it out, because then you create more mercury vapor. And mercury vapor goes up your nose, and it's a shortcut to your brain. So you want to have a separate nose piece that has oxygen on it. So that's another feature. You also need to use lots and lots of water and high-speed suction. And in our practice, we do all of that, of course. And in our practice, we also have air purifiers and negative ion generators, because we're worried about ourselves as well. And we've tested ourselves regularly to see whether the precautions we take for ourselves and our staff are okay, and our mercury levels are low. So that's reassuring.
Oh, fantastic.
That's good. Well, we didn't really get into nutrition completely. Do we have time to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I mean, in my book, I outline, I think there are eight problems with our nutrition in our society, and I think I'll just focus on the principles of a nourishment, of being nutritious, and that they are really quite simple. I mean, I think as a general rule in the book, as the problems I identify become more complex, I believe the solutions are actually remarkably simple.
Yeah.
And so, from a nutritional perspective, I think vegetables should be the cornerstone of everybody's diet. And we need lots of colours. We need to eat the rainbow, because they have phytonutrients that help us detoxify and deal with the chemical loads that we're exposed to today. We don't have enough fibre. We need to be asking ourselves, we haven't talked about the microbiome, but, we're more bacteria than we are human cells. So every time you put something in your mouth, you need to ask, are you feeding your friends or your foes? And we need to have a very friendly relationship with our microbiome. I think a moderate amount of ethically grown and sustainably grown protein, and by that I don't mean factory farmed meats. I believe, free range is a must. Biodynamic is fabulous. Organic is also great. If you can combine all of those and you think they're too expensive, well, just buy less. It's probably better for you anyway. So, healthy fats, the fat off those animals, butter from those animals, coconut oil, olive oil, macadamia nut oil. I stay right away from seed oils. Seed oils are a no-no. I think grains, the green revolution that produced enough food for us has introduced varieties of grains that I don't believe are very good for the planet, and they're not very good for people. So I would limit that or eliminate that. And I think water, there's a whole story. In my own home, I use a reverse osmosis filter that takes everything out, and then I add a few grains of Himalayan rock salt or Celtic sea salt, and hey presto, I've got really clean homemade mineral water. So water is still by far the best. What else have we got? Seafood. Oh gosh, I stay right away from seafood. I think there are two issues there. One of sustainability. We have raped and pillaged 90% of the world's seafood stocks. I don't think factory farming is a good solution, because what we end up feeding the fish, that's a whole other story I cover in the book. I don't like it. If I was going to have and then there's the whole toxicity issue. Not just mercury, but plastics are ubiquitous. So we used to be able to say, well, if you eat smaller fish, then the mercury content is not such a problem, but plastics find their way into the smallest of fish, and that's a problem. That's a real problem. I used to say sardines were a really good alternative, and I still think they probably are, and anchovies and calamari. So these smaller fish, if I had to eat one, wild caught would be it. What else have we got? Salt. Salt's another one, much maligned. I would stay away from table salt. I think we don't just need sodium and chloride. We actually need the 60 or 70 trace elements that find their way into some of the more complex salts like Himalayan rock salt and Celtic sea salt, although Celtic sea salt may have plastics in them, so, and I think that's why I prefer Himalayan rock salt because
it's such a great area, because for me, like, Himalayan is also like we're mining the Himalayas for rock salt. And
I know. And
so,
it was
What about the Australian lake salt?
Yeah, I think that's probably okay. I think, So, I think those kind of more complex salts, we need salt. Again, much maligned. So that gives you kind of a nutritional, and definitely do not get preoccupied by low fat.
Yeah.
Low fat. I have some people who they hear low carb is really good and they hear low fat is really good. And so they have an each way bet. They have low carb and low fat, and that's a terrible combination.
Yeah.
I do believe low carb. I think low carb is important. I think 70 grams of carbohydrates a day is manageable. It's a doable thing. If you're an athlete, maybe 120 or more, I don't know. But I think for an everyday person, keeping the carbs low, everybody that I've spoken to about cancer, heart disease, autoimmune, you name it, lower the insulin level, the better you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see in your book you also talk about not restricting your above ground vegetables, but your root vegetables. Like, that's a good way to put it for people.
Yes.
So things that grow underground are going to be the starchy tubers of the plants where they store their energies and they have more carbohydrates. And then so the potatoes, for instance, or the sweet potatoes, you limit those, whereas the broccoli and the spinach and all that kind of stuff, zucchinis, you'll eat them and you won't even count calories or anything like that. You'll just eat them.
Yeah, exactly. And you get the phytonutrients.
That's right. And these are very important for us. There's going to be a podcast with Dr. Jason Horelak, who's going to talk for like an hour and 20 minutes on the phytonutrients of plants and how they affect the microbiome. So it's really, really a great topic to get into. And I want to talk a little bit about movement and posture to round up the interview, because we've pretty much addressed most of the topics of the book, and I want to end on that.
Yes, well, there again, you look on the train and, let's back up a little bit. We got up on our two legs as humans. This was millions of years ago, and we balanced this 4 to 5 kilo thing on our head, on our spine, called our head, and it was quite a challenge. It poses some postural challenges for us. Now, when you then look down at your phone, say 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 25 degrees, you change that 4 to 5 kilo load to 10 kilos. And then a little bit further down into your lap and you change it to 27 kilos. And then, so now you've created some real postural problems. Or sit in front of your computer and push your head forward off your spine. So posturally, we have all sorts of things that have challenged us, particularly in recent times. Again, look on the train and look at everybody's 4 to 5 kilo head translated into a 10 to 27 kilo head because of their posture. So there's that. Sleeping posture, also very important. The best position to sleep in is on your side. Stomach sleeping is by far the worst for your head, neck, jaw muscles, lower back, airway, you name it. So side sleeping is best for airway and digestion. And then toilets. I even include toilet because for millions of years we squatted, and our anatomy within our colon and rectum, it lends itself very well to the squatting position of the toilet. And sitting on the toilet, and look, sanitation is a fabulous thing, but sitting on the toilet creates some issues. Another thing I deal with, I did a lot of research with...
I should mention here that we have poop stoops.
Yeah,
it's called the stoop. It's really good. Stoop.
But that's basically, then we look at foot structure, and it surprises me how often people who have suffered for years for lower back pain or years for hip or knee problems have never had a proper podiatric assessment. That's an assessment by a podiatrist who understands the biomechanics of feet, who's not just interested in corns and bunions. So, that's kind of some of the stuff I talk about in posture. And in terms of movement, you don't have to move. I didn't call the chapter exercise. I called it movement.
I like that.
We have to get up and move and build that into our day. So that's really important.
It's good. Well, there's a lot more.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
The thing about the book is it's like such a really good book to introduce you to all this information, and some of it, like breathing, for instance. I would really love to know how people can find out more. Is there references in the book on how people can advance their journey to, say, breathe better, or what kind of steps they can take? Does that get included in the book as well?
Look, Fuad, one of the reasons I wrote this book was because it was a conversation I wish I could have had with every single patient I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I'm really proud of it because it takes people on this journey. The first part is kind of about where we're at in the world, health-wise, the different views, and why health messages are so confusing. The second part is about the stresses that affect us, and the third part is what you can do about it, and that's the 5 pillars. So, yes, there are lots of things within the book about breathing, and it's it's very conversational. So I think the main message I'd want to leave people with is, are they a mouth breather or a nasal breather? Because we could do a whole program on that alone. It's really significant.
Maybe we should do a program on this. Because it is definitely a big problem. Like, as we're talking about people who are now being born with the mom is eating a nutritionally deficient diet, then the child will have less of a chance for proper jaw development, and that's going to affect their breathing, and they're going to be breathing through their mouth, and we're going to see more and more mouth breathers, really. And so in essence, we should be talking about this quite a lot, and to help teach people about it. So maybe Dr. Ehrlich will have you come back and give us some practical tips on this one. But thank you so much for being on the show. I know you have to run off and get to your appointments, but thank you so much for being on the show, and we hope to have you again soon and delve more and more deeply into these topics with you.
Where can we tell people to find you?
Well, you can go on to the drronehrlich.com. That's EHRLICH.
We'll put the links in the show notes as well.
Links in there, and that's where they can find out more information. Or my practice, the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre.
Where can they find the book?
The book they can find hopefully at any good bookstore or Amazon or Booktopia. There's actually an Audible version of the book, which I did the Audible version a few months ago, and it just came out about 3 or 4 weeks
fantastic.
ago. Yes,
that's awesome.
That's good. You can hear me for 12 and a half hours.
Life Less Stress, the 5 pillars of health and wellness. Dr. Ron Ehrlich, thank you so much for being with us on the show.
Thanks so much.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/The Wellness Couch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.